everybody, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar today hosted by the Medicines Management team and Let's Make Lemonade, which is giving you an overview of learning culture, which is the first of 8 quality statements that form part of the SAFE key question or domain of the CQC's framework. This is the second webinar in the series so far, which is intended generally to improve CQC awareness and compliance for providers working across primary care. The first webinar gave an update on the CQC framework and what changes we can expect, and that is recorded and available for you to watch. And I'll ask one of my colleagues to put the link in the chat now for you if you would like to catch up on webinar number 1 in the series. In terms of housekeeping today, the chat and the Q and answer functions are on. So if you have any comments and questions, please do pop them in the chat as we go along, and we'll do our best to pick them up during the course of the webinar or even follow up with you afterwards by email, depending on the nature of your question. And this will be recorded and the recording will be shared with you afterwards. So feel free to sit back a little and absorb rather than focus on taking notes. Let me introduce you to everybody today. My name is Dr. Clare Sieber, and I'm a working GP and clinical advisor for the Medicines Management team. And I'll now introduce you to the rest of the panel that you'll be hearing from today, whose experience will give you some broad viewpoints on the CQC framework, its impact on us as providers, and its everyday sort of application in primary care settings. So Gabby, I'll hand over to you to then pass over to Gary and Mateen, and then Mateen will hand over to Rashad to introduce you all to the Medicines Management team in a bit more detail, and then Gabby will then take over to deliver the content of the webinar. Thanks, Gabby.
Great, thanks Claire, and hi everybody. Yeah, it's great to see so many people joining us today. So my name is Gabby Ashton. I am a CQC compliance and quality assurance specialist now. I have a background in both health and social care, kind of in compliance, quality assurance and management roles. And I joined CQC as an inspector for about 4.5 years before then setting up Let's Make Lemonade, which I now run independently, and I offer sort of CQC compliance support in a variety of different elements. So I'll introduce you or hand over to Gary to introduce himself.
Thanks, Gabby. So yeah, my name's Gary Hughes. I've been in primary care for just over 17 years. I was a practice manager for over 13 of a large 2-site training practice in Berkshire. I now support practices, PCNs and federations in all areas of business leadership and management through my company, Leadership in Practice. Mateen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you so much, Gary, as well. So just to introduce myself, hi, I'm Dr. Sheikh Mateen Ellahi, GP partner working in the front line of general practice. I also spend time advising and consulting on digital health, technology and clinical safety. Genuinely looking forward to today's practical and session giving clinical perspective. Thank you.
Hi everybody, lovely to meet you all. My name is Rashad. I'm a pharmacist and advanced clinical practitioner with many years experience in primary care. I also work as a director at the Medicines Management team, which is an award-winning provider of remote pharmacist and pharmacy technician services to GP practices and PCNs across the UK. Some quick facts about the Medicines Management team before we get into the webinar. We're an established provider of pharmacy services for around 8 years. We're trusted by 85 PCNs and 250 plus GP practices. We provide managed pharmacy services from our remote training hub. It's fully supervised by GPs and senior pharmacists. We handle all clinical, IT and HR queries in-house, and it's a completely off-hand managed service, which includes training, auditing, HR, finances, with no additional costs, and it's fully within ours. We can quickly get our services up and running within 2 to 4 weeks. So if you're a GP practice or a PCN looking to hire a pharmacist, be that short-term cover, such as sickness or excess hours, or long-term cover, get in touch and see how we can help you today. Over to you, Claire.
Gabby.
Thank you. Okay, so today we are going to, as Claire has mentioned, we're going to kick off with the first of the 8 quality statements that sit under the key question, the first key question SAFE. So this is learning culture, which I think I know will be a very interesting one, because for everybody in the room and everybody who's joined us, learning culture is, well, as it says on the tin, it's talking about culture rather than something quite tangible or specific that we may see throughout the remaining key question, the quality statements in SAFE. For example, when we look at medicines, or we look at safeguarding, or we look at risk assessments, they're all things that we can kind of quite clearly talk about and document, whereas learning culture is it's a much more open-ended discussion point. So hopefully we'll have some meaningful conversations today. So the way that the webinars will work is we will look at the legislation that underpins each of the quality statements. So we'll talk about the Health and Social Care Act and the fundamental standards. Then we will have a look at some recently published CQC reports. So these were taken from December 2025 and January 2026. And we're looking at a variety of providers that have received ratings from inadequate all the way through to outstanding, particularly reporting on this quality statement, so we can see in real time what the CQC are looking for and what they're kind of keeping their eyes and ears out for. So just the some people think it's the boring bit. I think it's the fun bit. This is the legislation that underpins the first quality statement. So as we spoke about in the very first webinar that we did, we talked about sometimes we hear a lot of noise and there's a lot of kind of information out there about the way in which the CQC is changing. But the one thing to really keep a hold of is the fact that the actual legislation that underpins the variety of different frameworks the CQC bring out, that hasn't changed. So when we look at learning culture, we can see that there are four key, four pieces of legislation, so four of the fundamental standards that underpin this particular quality statement. So we're thinking about Regulation 20, which talks about duty of candour, Regulation 16, which is specifically receiving and acting on complaints, but it does link directly to the concept of freedom to speak up and creating a safe and open culture within the workforce. It's underpinned by Regulation 12, safe care and treatment. So specifically the CQC are interested in organisational learning and actions, and also Regulation 17, which is good governance. And again, the CQC here are looking for how you demonstrate continuous improvement. So anything that you have embedded, how you continue that over a period of time and demonstrate long-term impact and sustainability. So in terms of some reports that we've got extracts from recently published reports. So the first one here in the bottom right hand corner is anything blue is outstanding, anything green is good, red is inadequate, and orange requires improvement, just for reference. So this service here received, this GP practice here, they received an outstanding rating, which means they would have had a score of 4 out of 4 for this particular quality statement. And the CQC has said that all staff were invited to significant events review meetings, and all significant events were discussed in regular protected learning time meetings to allow all staff to contribute to learning. There were processes in place to share minutes from meetings with those who were unable to attend meetings. So hopefully this is something we can have a bit of a discussion about and some food for thought as we go throughout the webinar. But I think without the CQC being able to put any words in bold or underline, I think what they're really kind of energised by here is the fact that all staff are invited to meetings and that they are given specific protected learning time. We often see, and Gary and Mateen and Clare and Rashad will have kind of more real life examples of this, but I, as an ex-inspector and on the work I do now, I often see that learning events may only be shared with certain groups. For example, if it's a clinical learning event, it might only be for clinicians to talk about. If it's non-clinical, it might be for the practice manager and their team to lead on. And actually that information sharing can get lost. So it's positive to see that it's being shared across the whole department, across the whole practice. Another outstanding rating here is thinking about, so the CQC have reported here, representatives from the PPG felt that the service took concern seriously and proactively made improvements to the service. They took their views on board and consistently involved them in new initiatives and campaigns, and the PPG had recently audited signage at the practice, and management took their views on board to make improvements to the signage in place. Again, kind of hearing about the collaboration between the PPG and the practices, I can see why this would receive an outstanding score. We've spoken in the past, in previous webinars we've done about really making the most of the PPG to support you with audits and getting that real time and real life and people with lived experience and to come in and support you with audits. So it's fantastic to see that that's still happening. I've only really seen it a few times. So a good rating here that staff were able to provide us with examples of learning identified from incidents. For example, the provider had identified and arranged additional emergency response training to improve staff confidence and response in future events. So that's great to think that, you know, again, that learning has actually happened from a specific event and then they've embedded a long-term plan. And here we've got a service that received an inadequate rating. So of the 24 staff that the CQC received feedback from, 13 stated they were not invited to the meetings where the SEAs were discussed. So you see this is parallel to the outstanding rating next to it. The practice were unable to locate the majority of the meeting minutes, so we could not see evidence they were discussed by partners or leaders. And during the assessment, different staff told us about 3 separate SEAs that we could find no record for the practice manager. And we were told that none had been completed. So that's absolutely something that we'll unpick today, but record keeping, for anyone that knows the CQC knows that they like to see it. So we've got some more reports here. This is specifically looking at risk management. So part of the way that the quality statements work is that they're broken down into sort of bullet points, so there's more detail that's provided under each of the quality statements. And this one here is looking, part of the learning culture is looking at how risks are kind of seen, acknowledged, and then dealt with. So the CQC want to know that they're dealt with willingly as an opportunity to put things right, and that raising concerns does actually proactively identify. So raising concerns helps to proactively identify and manage risks before safety events happen. So an outstanding report here, we've reviewed 10 forms completed in the past year. There's no evidence of any investigations. I think that's the wrong colour, sorry, that should be red. And no evidence that anyone other than the person completing the form had been involved. That's our fault. That should be the inadequate rating on there. So you can see that essentially the paperwork has been completed. So the first step of the process is correct, but then there's been no continuity. So no learning has taken place, no sharing, and therefore no kind of long-term impact or sustainability has been embedded. Good. So this is a quite straightforward piece of feedback. There was a system to record and investigate complaints, and when things went wrong, staff apologised and gave people support. So that's kind of a very fundamental baseline that we would be looking for. And this here is the outstanding one, so the other way around. So the practice had a significant event policy that included examples of incidents that might trigger an SEA. That's really, I mean, that in itself is fantastic, because we often see policies that, well, we know that policies aren't always the most fun thing to read, but to have real-time examples to guide staff is, you know, that's quite a meaningful learning opportunity for people. So these included new cancer diagnoses, violent or aggressive patients, and breaches of confidentiality. And we saw examples of this type of incident. And none had been recorded as an SEA. So sorry, we might need to go back and double check the colours for this. That wouldn't have received an outstanding rating. That would also be a risk, because they've got the policy right and they've included examples. So the first steps have gone well, but then the actual recording of it hasn't been followed through. So again, when we're thinking about the long-term governance systems in place, that hasn't been well managed. And lastly, we've got some feedback here. This is looking at how investigations are appropriately managed and how they result in change that can improve care. So there had been no formal complaints, and informal complaints were recorded in patient records, not on the complaints register as stated on the service website. So they could not be reviewed for trends and outcomes. We reviewed significant events and near misses and found that although they were recorded and investigations had taken place, there was no evidence of an investigation outcome or actions taken. And then here, following a recent incident involving the practice being unaware of a patient having a pessary fitted before accessing their services, they conducted an internal audit and recognised there were system-wide issues. They shared this piece of best practice piece of work with other local practices through the ICB to identify other patients in the local area who were potentially lost to a follow-up. So that's an example of an outstanding rating when we think about the initiative and then the partnership working that took place. So we're just going to have a look now, we're just going to have a bit of a conversation now about learning culture and the kind of some of the concepts and some of the kind of best practice research that sits underneath this. As I mentioned at the beginning, kind of the word learning culture or the concept of learning culture can feel quite vague, quite large. Where do we start? Where do we kind of unpick that? So there's lots of research out there, lots of best practice guidance, and one particular piece that we found is unpicking the idea of learning culture into 3 different categories. And I'm sure Gary in particular, with his expertise in management, will know more about what good culture, kind of learning culture looks like. One of these suggestions here is that you can break it down into learning culture, learning organisation, and learning climate. So we're thinking from a culture perspective about how you're embedding the learning into the systems, possibly thinking about promoting and rewarding learning at individual, team and organisational level. And I know in the past we've spoken about rewards and kind of the pros and cons of that in the workplace. Learning organisation, so supporting the transformation of an organisation by allowing it to develop and adapt and looking to enhance organisational capability. And from a climate perspective, we're thinking about how employees perceive workplace practices and processes that relate to their learning. This concept also does link to, for anyone that's worked with myself in the past, I always talk about the 3 Ps, so triangulating your evidence for the CQC and thinking about your patients, your personnel, so your workforce, and your processes and systems. And we can see here that the learning culture concept has been broken down into so your workforce, how they perceive and understand a learning climate, how the organisation supports learning. So from a kind of a practical point of view, it's also thinking about the patients, as we've heard from the outstanding ratings with the PPGs and their involvement, how they perceive you to be open to a learning culture. So some enablers, some positive things that we see that work well in the workplace. We've got the behaviours of staff. So we're looking from a CQC point of view at what teamwork means to people, and do they tell us and can they demonstrate that they have trust between their peers and their colleagues. Thinking about communication, so how people talk to one another. It's very, very interesting, as when you do mock inspections, you can very quickly do observations in kind of communal spaces or staff rooms or passing corridors, and seeing how staff communicate with one another and what that demonstrates about a positive workplace culture and consequently a learning culture. Thinking about psychological safety, so again, how safe people feel to speak up and whether or not they feel they have leaders who are open to feedback. How organisations work, so do you have shared direction, shared goals, a shared vision? And how do you involve patients or people who use services? So how do you listen to their voices to make decisions? And then some barriers that we quite commonly see from a learning culture perspective include, I mean, some of them are quite obvious, but staff tiredness from shift work, particularly if you are working shift work, or actually if you're working part-time, full-time. If people feel that they're not included in the main team, that can have a huge impact on learning culture. So if they think, well, we only work Wednesdays and Thursdays, let's say, but actually the meetings are always on Tuesdays, so we don't get access. We get access to the minutes, but we're not invited to meetings. Or we work, an afternoon and evening, and our managers work mornings, so there's a crossover. Anything that prevents people from feeling that they are part of the main hub can be a barrier to a learning culture. Staff members feeling that there are rules being imposed on them. I think that's an interesting one. yeah, Gary might have some. Well, maybe I'll come back to Gary with that one, or Claire can pick Gary's brains about that one. But the idea of rules being imposed upon them is an interesting one. A lack of clear expectations, responsibilities, and standards. So we know that without kind of clear job descriptions, which again aren't always reviewed in a timely manner, and people think that they are just bits of, you know, paperwork that sit in the dusty cupboard once they've been signed, but actually using those in a really meaningful way can contribute very effectively to a learning culture. Thinking about CPD, professional development, career development, anything like that. Having a high staff turnover means that good ways of working can be lost. When there is a fear that staff will be blamed and staff feeling alone, again, it's a difficult one to, well, it's not that difficult, but yeah, it's one that we see quite commonly, where managers might say, of course staff can come to me, of course I have an open door policy, no, we have a learning culture, but actually how do they demonstrate that effectively when communicating with their workforce? And then a lack of training and qualification opportunities will obviously stifle people's interest or commitment to improving the service or contributing to the improvements. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move over. We're going to speak to Gary and Mateen as well. We've got some inspector questions, provider questions, questions that we would put to providers from an inspection point of view. So we'll hear from them. And then I also know that Claire's got some questions as well for the team. So Gary, question for you. A deep dive into this quality statement appears to put emphasis on culture, but we know that poor systems and processes contribute directly and indirectly to safe care and treatment. If a service are working in an environment where they know the systems and processes aren't up to scratch, what are some interim workaround suggestions?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do you know, I'm not sure that there are workarounds where safety is concerned. You know, I think if you've got a safety issue, then I think that actually in that instant, you need, action straight away on that to immediately, assess the situation and address it. So it might be that you're going to do a risk assessment and see what the risk is, see what you can do to mitigate it. But when it's safety concerned, I'm not sure that there are any sort of workarounds that you could do. But even if it's not a safety issue, and let's say we're talking about efficiency as being a problem, the problem with workarounds is that they never really fix the issue. They're just a sticking plaster that you've put on. And the problem with that is everyone can see it. Everyone knows that that's what it is. So bringing it back to your sort of opening line in the question about, the culture, the sticking plaster, it's not going to support a positive culture. Ultimately, culture is defined by the worst behaviours that we tolerate. So it's actually far better to do the right thing and fix the issues than do the easy things with workarounds.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. That's great. I suppose, I mean, often I come across situations and it's one or the other. So it's staff might tell us that or I might get the impression that staff are really keen to demonstrate that they are open to learning, that they want to report incidents, that they've spotted this and they're not sure it's the right thing. But then actually they immediately hit a barrier because they don't know where the SEA forms are, or what system to use, or who receives them, where do they get investigated. Or they say things to me, yeah, I reported this, but I've not heard about it since. So there's no continuous conversation or communication. Or it's the other way around, where providers have invested a huge amount in technology, digital forms and great practice management, meeting agendas, but the culture isn't there. So all the systems are in place. And so it sounds like from what you're saying that actually to get the culture bit is the bit that's more important, and getting that right will then lead to.
Yeah. And everything you just said there, Gabby, that sounds to me, there's issues with communication. If people don't know where policies are and don't know the procedures for reporting SEAs, is there a problem with communication? So if so, let's fix that. Or it might be that if they're frightened to do it, you know, maybe actually the values of the leaders in the practice and the managers in the practice are not supporting it, not making it safe. So let's fix that. You know, the culture is absolutely going to be informed by the worst behaviours that you tolerate. So let's get the behaviours right. Yeah. And that's actually going to support a far more, you know, positive, a better culture.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm going to be really mean and ask you another question now. How, from a practice manager or a registered manager or anyone in leadership, from a leadership perspective, how do you self-assess how good you are at creating that culture? Because again, I often hear leaders say to me, yes, we have an open door policy. Oh, they can come to me anytime they want. Yeah. But what does that mean in reality? And what's a kind of maybe a top tip for self-assessment?
Yeah, and I hear that as well. Absolutely. You know, leaders and managers that think the culture is great and they say things like open door and everything. You know, ask the staff, do a 360 survey of your staff and ask what they really think. And it can be a frightening, scary thing to do. But if you really want to know, ask your staff. Yeah, ask them the really honest questions.
Yeah, fantastic. Simple but effective.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, Mateen, from a clinical perspective, what level of involvement do you have with your PPG? And reflecting on this, could it be better? Is it necessary to have a clinical representative meeting with this group? And what do you think some of the benefits, but also barriers, would you face if you did want to get more involved with your PPG?
Thank you for asking that question. Actually, really interesting points by Gary just made there about involving all of the team. And I guess that's a good segue into this one. So in all honesty, my involvement with the PPG is more of a supportive role and not consistent as I'd probably like it to be, I'll be honest with you. I think we'll come on to the barriers that cause that, but it's something I think we all as GP partners and GPs clinicians can improve on. Whether we have a designated PPG person who is on, you know, who's there and they have essentially a backup present if someone's on annual leave that can represent them in the PPG meetings. Often the PPG meetings obviously happen after hours as well, so that can be a barrier as well. Our PPG is relatively quite engaged and gives valuable feedback. We actually take them on board quite a lot. We've had several projects in the community, as well as, you know, building our own building, and we actually coordinated with our PPG to support us along with the council to have the permission to build our buildings as well. So our PPG is quite integral to our planning. But is the clinical is clinical input advised, or is it needed every single time? That's the big question. So we have clinical input, but not every single meeting. I do think having a clinical input does make a difference, at least in some of the meetings, particularly when you're thinking about, you know, the living culture that we're discussing, CQC compliance. Patients often, I feel empowered to raise concerns if they are speaking to a GP partner who, you know, who's a partner of the practice essentially. They can then, you know, raise concerns if they're required, that we can discuss safety system issues, and a clinician can advise or help in answering some of the questions that the patients are bringing up. That having a clinician there in the meeting, in my opinion, has built that trust between us as partners throughout the practice and then the PPG. So that trust is there, that transparency is there. We feel fewer issues have escalated into any formal complaints. Thankfully, touch wood, we don't get that many formal complaints. And because we believe people and our patients can understand why the decisions are being made from the partnership perspective. And I think also models that openness culture, direct communication and reflection that CQC genuinely look at in a well-read and responsive practice. As I mentioned earlier regarding the barriers, the main barrier really is, in my opinion, time and sustainability. Clinicians, as we know in general practice, are very much stretched. There's a risk of, you know, what you don't want is like token attendance to tick a box. You don't want that. You want it to be done properly. So for me, it's a lot less about attending every single meeting, but making that meeting you are attending as valuable as possible. So certain meetings that I do attend have more of a more of a clinical input in those meetings, more of a clinical engagement, and that does end up providing a clear feedback loop as well, which then the patients can circulate between the friends or other patient groups as well.
Great, thank you. I can see Claire's got her hand raised. We've also got a question from Alison, so we'll come to you, Alison. We'll go to Claire first, and then we can get some thoughts over to you.
Thanks, Gabby. I might put Alison's question to Gary, because I'm sure I've heard him answer a very similar question before with something sensible. He's nodding his head. I think the thing I was going to say is that we can all acknowledge that the PPG can be very helpful to us at times, so it's worth giving it a go in terms of having a good relationship with them. And there's something about visibility. If you've got a business owner and a clinician there at the meeting, the PPG meeting, it sort of signals your investment in them and a bit of kind of respect and commitment, which hopefully then empowers them to give you sort of provide you with a valuable support in the way that you want the PPG to support you. Gary, have you got any tips for practices that are struggling to empower their PPG or have an active PPG in the way Alison said in her question?
Yeah, I absolutely. I don't think that's uncommon. Alison, when I was in practice, I didn't have a very good PPG. They were always bringing sort of complaints and issues that actually didn't belong there. And I took the decision to disband the PPG. And then I was for a while without a PPG. And the route that I took to get one was to actually select the patients. Now, we were lucky. I was in East Berkshire and we had like an expert patient program running by a foundation trust called Health Makers. And I got them to start off with a program with a small group of invited patients to teach them how to be those expert patients through Health Makers. And the proviso was that they went on to become my patient group. And we were recruited into that as well. Now, I left the practice in 21, and I know that group is still going and are very active. So I think, you know, the answer, if you haven't got one, I wouldn't be frightened of disbanding one if it's not very good. And then I would actually select and invite ones. And if you've got something like an expert patient group that can help support it, or maybe Health Watch, ask them as well.
Great, thanks, Gary, and thanks, Claire. Yeah, I think just going back to the visibility aspect that Claire mentioned from the CQC point of view, that's, yeah, you can see why those services where they've been rated outstanding, and they talked about the visibility from partners, GP leads across the patient group has been a benefit. And as Mateen said, it doesn't have to be everyone, but it certainly shows commitment. And also, if one of the partners is the CQC registered manager, then they need to demonstrate they have assurance anyway from a compliance perspective and a partnership and communities and responding and listening to feedback. So it's only going to strengthen your ability to demonstrate to the CQC how you're kind of working towards a positive learning culture. Okay, Gary, question for you. One of the barriers we've discussed to promoting an open learning culture are staff feeling alone. So what are your thoughts on this? I mean, my initial thought was, in a busy GP practice, how do you think it would come about that staff would feel alone, and what could be done to address this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think staff should ever feel alone, you know, even if they're working on their own. And you know, when I was back in practice, I had that occasionally at branch surgery, you know, staff work on their own, but they should never feel alone. And if they are, you know, then for me, that's actually a problem about poor or absent leadership. You know, and in terms of addressing that, if you've got staff that are feeling alone, or you think you might have, then it's down to the leaders and the managers, making sure that you've got an inclusive, a supportive, a collaborative culture. And going back to, you know, the answer to the previous question, you can't just say we're inclusive, we're supportive. You know, it doesn't work like that. You've got to demonstrate that you are. You've got to actually show it by your values that you are inclusive and supportive, all those things. You know, and that's going to make sure that staff are not feeling alone. So, I think it's about the leaders and the managers demonstrating that those values are in place, and also checking in with staff. And when that, we do that, it's often that we check in with the most visible or our favourites, the ones that like to talk, to see that they're feeling supported and included. But actually, no, you've got to seek out all of your staff, especially the quieter ones, or the ones that might be working on their own, to make sure that they're still feeling included, supported, happy, and ultimately safe.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Okay, and final question for Mateen. Can you please share a recent incident where duty of candour applied? Although I think one of the other panel members might have a funny example too, but where duty of candour is applied, what were the reflections from the team after having met with the patient and the family?
Yeah, so it's an incident involving essentially a technology that we've made in-house, which was right at the start about a year ago, where we were auto-filing some of the results. And one of the results was not auto-filed, essentially on time. So it was an abnormal investigation result where the system worked in terms of eventual identification, but not as early as it should have. The patient didn't come to any harm, but the threshold for duty of candour, because there was a potential of harm and a clear system failure. So we did contact the patient promptly, explain what had happened, apologized, and met them with answers to any questions that they did have. Importantly, we did focus on being transparent rather than, being defensive, and on listening to the patient and how did the delay occur, and how whether it did in the end affect their trust between them and us and confidence, and not just the clinical outcome itself. So we value our patients quite strongly, and our reputation is obviously quite high with our Google rating, etc. as well. So we wanted to keep that relationship with the patient. And I think transparency goes a long way. Often our reviews on Google demonstrate that the doctors do contact us if there is a fault quite promptly, and if there's made a mistake, they contact us as well. So we're very proud of that. And I think the patients like that. Patients want to know we are humans at the end of the day. Mistakes will happen, but as long as you contact them, you can build that trust. I think overall the reflection during the team were quite powerful in some regards. We recognize that this wasn't about individual mistakes, it's about system failure, and why did that happen? How can we change that? It can sometimes be about workload, it can sometimes be about time pressures, handovers, safety netting advice that you may be giving. And what happened after that was a practical change in the workflow itself of the automated filing, around result tracking, auditing, and clear ownership of those administrative tasks. In my opinion, the biggest learning was that duty of candour isn't just tick box, isn't just a regulatory requirement. When it's done well, it strengthens trust, not just between you and the staff, but you and the patients. And it can turn an uncomfortable situation into actually a positive one, because at the end of the day, that trust can be even higher with the patient sometimes if you are open and transparent with information.
Yeah, fantastic. I think I can see Gary nodding his head. I think everyone's probably nodding that it's absolutely, it goes beyond a tick box. And although it is, a fundamental standard and a CQC requirement, there's so much more that can be gained from really deep diving into the principles of duty of candour and what that means, and then the learning that can come from it. And I think when I'm out and about, it's often something that's not considered enough. It's kind of, okay, this incident, does it meet the threshold, yes or no? It's very black and white, and then we move on. But actually there can be grey areas in between when we think about potential learning, learning that can come from this, and preventing things from happening again, which do all quite clearly apply to a learning culture. So I always encourage practices or any service I'm working with to make sure that within your SEA forms or with any flowcharts or SOPs or policies that you have, the duty of candour is embedded into that right from the offset, so that it's always considered, and it's always discussed, in order to demonstrate that you're considering it. Claire, have you come in?
Thanks, Gabby. Yeah, I have another example that I might share that's slightly humorous, but demonstrates the point of why duty of candor is good and why it was worth doing, being honest with the patient, and the patient then taking it forward, because it then did result in some change. And had I stayed quiet, it would have all gone very differently. It was a patient that I called in using the intercom at the practice, and they come up into my room and they started talking to me about their sex life. And after about an hour, sorry, not an hour and a half, about a minute and a half, I got a little pop-up note on the corner of my screen saying, "Claire, you've left the intercom on." So I obviously quickly turned the intercom off, didn't interrupt the patient where they were mid-flow about their sex life. But once they'd finished talking, I said, "Look, just before we go any further, I'm really sorry. The intercom was still on and I've turned it off now. Somebody sent me a message, but so sorry about that." And I kind of been thinking to myself, I've got to say this to her, although this is going to go down really badly. And it's just as well I did, because she said, "Oh God, my daughter's sitting in the waiting room, so she would have heard that." So it made me think, well, I'm glad I told you, because if a hand had told you, your daughter would have told you, and then that would have been even worse for me. So there's a kind of honesty is the best policy thing. And she was all right about it. We had a joke, and how, you know, her daughter's probably going to be the person most mortified by it. But she did, unfortunately, although probably fortunately, submit a little complaint letter afterwards to the practice manager. And what then happened was that the practice manager was able to work out that we could, when we call the intercom on our phone, we can have a kind of a rule set that whenever that particular number is called, the call only lasts 15 seconds and then it always cuts off. So because the patient had then complained, the practice was then able to do this thing that made sure actually it never would happen again. Because it would always automatically cut off, even if we'd forgotten to press the off button. And I know, you know, I talked about it with my colleagues afterwards, and they say, "Oh, you know, Bob always used to do that when he was a partner back in the day." And I'm sure I definitely wasn't the first person to have done it, but I was sort of the first person to always come clean about it, and that was the first patient that then complained. But because that happened, it then meant it never happened again. So I hope that's a slightly humorous but useful example of why actually this stuff is good, because it ultimately results in a change that means it never happens again.
Yeah, that's the most imperfectly perfect example of how duty of candor applies from an incident perspective. Yeah, I think if you were to advise the CQC of that on an inspection, they'd probably be quite satisfied actually with they should be quite satisfied with the process that was followed and the way in which that was dealt with. So we're nearly wrapping up. I'm just going to kind of run through a very quick summary from my point of view at a kind of top 10 tips of what learning culture looks like and things for you to think about. They're not on a slide, but they will be when you get the final slides. These are just some reflections that I've had from this conversation today. So some things that I'll be the CQC will be looking for from a learning culture perspective. First of all, we're thinking about staff training and development. And that also includes induction, so the quality of the inductions, the quality of the training, and ongoing professional development for staff, and how that promotes a learning culture. Thinking about promoting open communication and psychological safety, which Gary has given some sort of top tips and thoughts on. Thinking about your SEA forms, so want to be really clear about that you're documenting the who, the what, the when, the why, the where, and the how, so all information is really clearly captured, and also duty of candor to be considered. Patient and PPG involvement in learning events, so how can you, we've spoken about kind of the practice being involved with the PPG, but how can the PPG be involved with the practice, so that two-way dialogue. And if there is an opportunity to invite them to any learning event reviews or to share specific learning outcomes with the PPG, there would be benefits to that as well. Staff involvement in learning events, we've seen the outstanding reports that have come through from the CQC, and they're really kind of keen to report on whole practice involvement in learning events. Quality investigation, so really when we're out and we're looking at the SEA forms and the work that's being done, we're looking at the quality of the next steps that have been taken, rather than it just being seen as something to do and a kind of a process to follow. Deep dives are always, we're looking at the quality of the deep dives, thinking about benchmarking and comparisons, so looking at local and national data and making sure that you are benchmarking yourself accordingly. Communication and feedback. So we've seen from the reports and from hearing from Gary and Mateen and Clare about closing the loop and making sure that communication is continual. If you've got any safety improvement initiatives or you've introduced any as a result of learning, then demonstrating sustainability. So making sure the results are sustained over a long period of time, and making sure that the results can clearly demonstrate a positive impact for people, ultimately for patients and for the workforce. So that is the bulk of me talking. I'm going to hand over to Clare now, who will continue to chair us through.
Thanks, Gabby. I had a question for you, Rashad, now, if you don't mind, with your medicines management team hat on, because you're in quite this unique position where you provide people to go in and work in primary care teams. So I'm wondering, how do you ensure that safe learning culture with your team members in the practices they're working at, when they're often working remotely and sometimes only for a very short defined period of time, depending on how much R's budget a PCN might have to use up?
Good question, Claire. So this is a real challenge across primary care, and many of us on this webinar will have experienced very different cultures depending on the practice or PCN we worked in. Now, from my experience, there's no quick fix to creating a learning culture. At the medicines management team, how we tackle it is from the very start. For example, if we take on a new GP practice or a PCN, we begin with the initial meeting, clearly understand workflow, expectations and risks. And we don't assume learning is going to happen organically, and we design for it essentially. And how we go about it is we recruit and train pharmacists specifically to the needs of the practice. For example, if a practice wanted CKD reviews, and a lot of pharmacists won't be trained up on CKD, that risk is identified and the clinician is trained up front. So what this does is it removes uncertainty, variation, and it essentially stops errors being left to chance. Additionally, with our training, clinicians in-house clinical and system training, and what this does is it creates a shared standard and a safe baseline to work from. Additionally, from our remote training hub, each pharmacist or clinician is assigned a buddy pharmacist. So any clinical questions or concerns, we address it immediately, and 100% of the work is audited to ensure consistent quality and build confidence. And when it comes to incidents, we log errors centrally and track them via dashboard. What this does is it allows us to track patterns really at an organisation, PCN and practice level, and support the team. And that's without blame, but not without accountability. My final point I'd like to emphasise is, from my experience, learning doesn't just happen in training sessions. It happens when people feel safe really to ask questions, admit uncertainty and reflect honestly. So if we want safer systems in the future, we need to create environments where learning is normal and it's not something people are judged for. Over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Rasha. I totally agree. I think it's got to start with the people at the top, the business owners and the managers. You know, if you've never reported an event or had an SEA about something you've been involved in or spoken up, then how can you expect other people to? You've got to kind of be really transparent and obvious about when you're doing it, and that it's not just seen as a good thing to do or even the right thing to do, but is the expected thing to do, and demonstrating that through your own actions as well.
Most definitely.
Yeah, thank you. Probably got time for one more reflection, and it picks up on the thing Gabby talked about earlier when she was going through her slides about barriers to culture. And it was about the feeling of having rules imposed on you. And I was going to maybe bring Gary into this one because I know he would have a lot to say on that. It made me think, if you've got a work environment where people are feeling like things and rules and processes are being imposed on them, and therefore they're a bit reluctant to do them, that sounds like an environment where there perhaps isn't the shared values and vision that the CQC might also be looking for, the kind of place where that has been built and every member of the team has sort of co-designed the values, the visions, and the purpose of the organisation in the first place. Gary, you look desperate to say something about this.
No, I absolutely. Just before I do answer that, in the Q&A, Tim's given us a question as well, which you might want to come to. I just haven't seen it. But in answer to what you just said there, I think you're absolutely right. If rules are imposed, then it doesn't suggest to me a learning culture, because if you're not sharing, everybody's not sharing in the feedback and the learning, then I don't think you've got a complete learning culture. It sounds like it's just a few people that are saying this is what we need to learn and do. It doesn't feel inclusive if you are imposing rules on people. And I think, going back to the sort of questions that were asked earlier, I think that you will get people who are frustrated, demotivated, maybe feel alone. You won't get the best out of people and be developing people. And ultimately, as a general practice or primary care organisation, all of these things, if you're not getting the best from the team, your patients are going to feel it too. It's probably going to show in your regulation, in your meeting of regulations and your CQC, inspections as well. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's not a good place to be. It's not an uncommon place to be in general practice, rules being imposed, but it's not a good place to be.
Yeah. And it will come apart in a CQC inspection when somebody like Gabby in her former career would go and interview staff. It would become apparent that they weren't feeling included and sort of bought into some of the stuff that you were doing and involved in shaping it. I'll come on to Tim's question. It's nice and specific, and I think it's very relevant for Gabby. You might be able to answer this one straight off, Gabby. Tim's practice are in the process of creating a new PPG. Is it acceptable to have an online group as opposed to meetings at the surgery?
Yes, so I've put the response in for you, Tim, but essentially, yes, so flexibility is fine. And actually, there will be pros and cons that will have been considered from an accessibility perspective. So I think the main thing is to make sure that that's what the PPG want and that's what works for them, rather than something that you are imposing on the PPG. And actually, then I would suggest monitoring. For example, I'm not sure where obviously you are, but if you are in a rural area or the PPG are thinking about accessibility, mobility, transport, etc., it might be that face-to-face doesn't work regularly, but I would consider monitoring that over a period of time. We often see PPGs maybe meeting for every other, so they might do one remote, one face-to-face, and continue that throughout the year. So monitor it over time, but make sure it's that concept is very much led by the PPG and not by the practice.
Thanks, Gabby. Mateen, did you have a final thought?
Yeah, I mean, final thoughts. Literally, final thoughts. I was thinking about culture, and I've worked as a locum doctor across the country, and I've worked as a partner in different practices. Well, a couple of practices really, and I said this in the first webinar: culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what I really mean by that is, if you don't have a learning culture, if the culture from the top isn't right, the other staff and certainly the patients will pick up on that very quickly, and you will slowly see that culture seep from the top to, right across the practice very quickly. So it's hugely important, if there are partners here listening to this, that your culture in the partnership, starting with the partnership deed, really stands out and you adhere to it, because everyone is looking up to you in some regards. And if you don't keep that culture and that learning culture and the openness culture present in the partnership, it can slowly work against you in the whole work you're doing. And what Gary mentioned at the start as well, the 360 feedback, I think that's really integral. This essence of very collaborative and very inclusive, and we have zero tolerance policies that often sometimes can be words. And the only way to really grow about it is actually listening to your staff, and having that 360 can can open a can of worms in some regards, but opening those can of worms can be helpful in actually alleviating those concerns which may later come about through complaints.
Thanks, Mateen. Nobody's ever going to be perfect. The only way you can improve is if you know where the issues are. Otherwise, you could just be blinkered and just get on and plow on. But that's not acceptable now to the CQC. Never mind, any other reason why you might think it's unacceptable to kind of have that approach to things. The CQC will not approve of it, and it's likely to affect the rating of the practice, and then have all of the sort of knock-on effects with recruitment and reputation and the list size and profits and all of the other things that might flow from the CQC rating. That sounds like a depressing note to end on. Sorry, everybody. Gabby's just got a final couple of slides that she'll flick through more about the medicines management team, and also Let's Make Lemonade, which is her CQC compliance support company that she runs. You will get the recording afterwards. I hope you enjoy it, and you'll also get an invitation to the next webinar next month, which is on now the next quality statement in SAFE, which is called Safe Systems, Pathways and Transitions. I think, what a mouthful.
Very good. Wow, well done, Claire. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's see what the CQC actually mean by safe systems, transitions and pathways, because it might be completely different to what we all think. And of course, we need to know what they mean by it in order to achieve it. So thank you very much, everybody who's been listening in the audience and contributing, and all of the members on the panel. It's been lovely to see you all, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.